Hi, everyone. I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to share some principles of Jyotish that can enrich your Western astrology. And although that was the original title of my talk, Jyotish Principles that can enrich your Western astrology, I've decided to focus on a particular digestible, manageable piece of that broader topic. I think the actual original slideshow would have taken just far more time than we have here. And one has to what's the saying? Eat an elephant one bite at a time, or one chunk at a time, so to speak. And so the topic I'm going to be focusing on today is the four aims of life and the houses of the horoscope, which, in my opinion, is one particular subset of all the different interesting principles of Jyotish that can enrich your Western astrology that is, I would say, particularly accessible and when it comes to the houses of the horoscope, I believe that generally speaking, Jyotish or Vedic astrology agrees with just about everything Western astrology associates with the houses. But often, Jyotish or Vedic astrology adds quite a few further layers of insight and associates the houses with many things that are not routinely associated with the houses in Western astrology. But because in both systems the houses are, at least as a concept, the same thing, I believe there's great benefit in comparison. I mean, as you all know, even within Western astrology on its own, there's a huge amount of diversity of opinion on which house system is the best house system and so on. So we're not going to get into all of those technical questions here. We're going to be speaking more about the symbolism of the houses, and in particular, the four house triplicities. And in Jyotish or Vedic astrology, the four house triplicities are associated with what they describe as Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Now, these four aims of life, as they're described, are called the Puruṣārthas. I might not be pronouncing that perfectly, but it's something like that. And what you see here is a screenshot of what Wikipedia says about the Puruṣārthas. And one of the things I would like to call your attention to in particular here is that this idea of the Puruṣārthas, or these four aims of life, it's not an astrological idea as such. It's a fundamental concept or principle in Hinduism, or in Vedic philosophy, you might say. We read here that Puruṣārtha literally means an object of human pursuit. It is a key concept in Hinduism and refers to the four proper goals or aims of life. The four Puruṣārthas are Dharma, righteousness or moral values; Artha, prosperity or economic values; Kama, pleasure, love or psychological values; and Moksha, liberation, spiritual values or self-actualization. Now, some of these descriptions here are not perfect. Like, I don't know if psychological values is the perfect way to describe Kama and so on, but that's a minor detail. All four Puruṣārthas are important. I would add, the idea is that we all have to, in some measure or other, engage with all four of these aims of life. They're all important. But in cases of conflict, Dharma is considered more important than Artha, Kama in Hindu philosophy. Moksha is considered the ultimate ideal of human life, inasmuch as Moksha is final spiritual liberation. At the same time, this is not a consensus amongst all Hindus, and many have different interpretations of the hierarchy and even whether or not one should exist. In other words, it's a matter of philosophical debate whether one can even say that one particular aim of life is more important than the other, because we have to partake of or fulfill in some degree all four of these four aims of life. Historical Indian scholars recognized and debated the inherent tension between active pursuit of wealth, or Artha, and pleasure, kama, and the renunciation of all wealth and pleasure for the sake of spiritual liberation, which is moksha. They proposed action with renunciation or craving-free dharma-driven action, also called nishkama karma, as a possible solution to the tension. And just the basic idea that you should take from this is that although we do need to fulfill all of these four aims of life, there are ways in which these different aims of life sometimes push or pull us into different directions, and they may superficially, even at times, seem to be in conflict with each other. And, you know, before we've even gotten into any birth charts, we already here have an interesting sort of template for you know, we call it philosophical contemplation about the different aims of life, and also how they intersect and interconnect. But okay, let's get to the actual astrology of it. The Dharma houses are the 1st, 5th, and 9th. The Artha houses are the 2nd, 6th, and 10th. The Kama houses are the 3rd, 7th, and 11th. The Moksha houses are the 4th, 8th, and 12th. Now, I'm sure you will recognize that what are called Dharma houses here, the 1st, 5th, and 9th, would correspond to the houses that correspond to the fire signs. So, you know, most Western astrology books that have discussed these 4 house triplicities would describe the 1st, 5th, and 9th as fire houses, the 2nd, 6th, and 10th as earth houses, the 3rd, 7th, and 11th as air houses, and the 4th, 8th, and 12th as water houses. And it's usually through this lens of the elements that these houses are viewed when they are discussed in Western astrology. And in fact, I would say that although some astrology textbooks do address this particular grouping, it isn't usually given a great deal of emphasis. It's not something that occupies a very prominent place in the usual discussion of houses in Western astrology. And, you know, one of the basic messages here, one of the basic things I'm trying to get across and share with you, and which I hope you recognize the significance and value of, is the fact that the way Vedic philosophy has framed these 4 groupings, or these the way Vedic astrology has linked these 4 aims of life to these 4 house triplicities, actually serves to sort of clarify how important they are, and yeah, generally gives them a greater significance and importance in the astrological scheme of things, because it is through analyzing a horoscope through this lens that we can gain some insight into how an individual is aligned to these 4 aims of life, and what their capacity will be to fulfill these 4 aims of life. Now, we'll go into some detail shortly about what Dharma is, what Artha is, what Kama is, what Moksha is. It was very briefly described in that screenshot from Wikipedia, but in a very basic, as a very basic description, we could say that the Dharma relates to our natural, spontaneous mode of self-expression, and therefore it's associated very much with the idea of the truth of one's being. And if you think of it, the fire element is associated with this spontaneity, we could also perhaps describe it as a type of honesty. The fire element is very very direct, very forthright, very not calculated. And so there's a lot of authenticity, and one might say integrity, in those houses. The Artha houses are, I think, a very close fit here to the way Western astrology would view the earth houses, because it is true that the Artha houses are associated with wealth, very broadly speaking, or maybe we should say a bit more precisely that they're associated with how we manage to access the material support that we need in this world. And so naturally the things we associate with the earth element would be a very close fit. Now, when it comes to the Kama houses, it's not quite as, we start to get a more nuanced picture, because in Western astrology, the air houses, the 3rd, 7th, and 11th, would be associated with communication and with our social world and our social relationships. And it's very important to note that in Vedic astrology, that way of viewing this triplicity would not be inaccurate, because the houses in Vedic astrology share many of the same meanings. The 3rd house, for example, is our day-to-day neighborly interactions. The 7th house, our connection to the mate. The 11th house, our association with connection with friends and groups and so on. But in Vedic astrology, the word Kama is connected here to those houses, and the meaning of Kama is desire. And so there's a whole new further layer of significance that is being pointed to there that I don't think is usually recognized in Western astrology. Then Moksha. Moksha is a word generally associated with the idea of final spiritual liberation. Now, the 4th, 8th, and 12th houses, or these, let's call them water houses, Western astrology would certainly recognize that they could relate to what we might call more sort of more inner dimension of a person's experience of life. And I won't go into too much detail now here, but broadly speaking, the Moksha houses are the places that in a way link us with that which is beyond this material world. Now, the Bhava Karakas, or house significators. Now, this could arguably be the subject of an entire presentation on its own, and I'm digressing here slightly, squeezing this a little look at this into this presentation, because further down the line, when we look at specific charts, it will be useful that I had mentioned this, and it will enable me to give a more, I suppose, authentically Vedic type of interpretation to some of those charts by the use of this principle. And most of horoscopic chart interpretation, Western or Vedic, is really a result of the sort of interweaving of planets and houses. And a lot of the ways the planets and houses connect is the same in both systems. Both systems would, for example, see a house as being affected by or conditioned by any planet that occupies that house. That's the most basic way we would look at a planet affecting a house. Beyond that, both systems would take the ruler of the house into consideration. That is, and the ruler of the house is, of course, either the planet that is on the planet that rules the sign on the cusp of a house, or if you're using whole sign houses, it is the lord of the sign that is in that house. It makes it a bit more clear in those cases, or with that house system. But now beyond these basic ways in which houses planets affect houses, in other words, by occupation or by rulership, there is also this principle of house significators, or bhava means house and karaka means significator in Jyotish. And these relationships are permanent. In other words, the sun is a permanent significator for everybody for the first house. Mercury and Jupiter are significators for the second house. Mars for the third house, and so on, as you see in this table. And this is quite a subtle and nuanced principle in Vedic astrology, and I really only started to really get it after quite a few years of working with Vedic astrology. So, to give an example of how this would work, if we wanted to understand what a person's third house is doing, we would look at what occupies the third house. We would look at the condition of the lord of the third house and all of those regular considerations. But we would also look at Mars. Whether or not Mars is in the third house or lord of the third house, Mars might, by the usual criteria, have nothing to do or no direct link to the third house, but we will look at Mars and the general strength of Mars to gain some insight into the general strength of a person's third house. So in other words, you might look at a chart in which the third house seems somewhat nondescript, in other words, in which there's nothing really particularly strong, either good or bad, perhaps, conditioning the third house. But if Mars is very strong in the chart, it's going to, in a sense, raise the third house up, and many of the meanings associated with the third house will become strengthened. I think some of you might even be a little bit surprised that Mars should have any link to the third house. And now this is again one of those little examples where Jotish associates a house with all the things Western astrology generally does, but has some further subtle insights into this. So, for example, the third house in both systems is associated with communication, with things like basic education, short journeys, things like this. But you see, even when we with Western astrology, when we speak of third house as being maybe associated with short journeys, we're starting to get to where this Mars energy comes from, because in Vedic astrology, the third house also is a more general sort of indicator of our level of courage and drive and motivation to get out there and make things happen. And you'll see, for example, that Mars is also one of the Bhava Karakas for the sixth house. And this is then highlighting a different aspect of Mars. In other words, Mars as a significator of injury or accidents, for example. And if Mars is very strong in a chart, it might mean that a person is actually quite capable of hard work and of engaging in conflict when necessary in a successful way. So if a person has a very, very strong Mars, it's going to, even if it's not linked directly to the third house or the sixth house, it's going to lift up both the third and sixth houses. Conversely, of course, if Mars is very weak, it's also going to weaken those houses. I think that's probably enough said for now. And as I said, I'm just touching very lightly on this here, so that if I invoke this principle later on, it's not a complete surprise, and you kind of know where I'm getting it. And as I said, this could be the topic of an entire presentation on its own. Let's get back to the actual 4 M's of life. And start with the Dharma houses. So Dharma houses relate to our life purpose, our authentic nature, luck, grace, and divinity. And so, this reference here to luck is quite important, because the idea is that when you follow your authentic nature, when you pursue your truth, it in a sense brings about a grace, and it brings about a good fortune, because it's like you're getting into a sort of the divine flow, if you like, and the universe sort of supports you. Like in Vedic astrology, it's very important to understand that that this particular house triplicity, the 1st, 5th, and 9th, is considered very fortunate, very blessed. And it could be argued that as astrologers, one of the most valuable things we can do for our clients, particularly when they are feeling trapped and stuck in life, is to help them find the road to, or access to, what Dharma is or can be for them. When a person can gain alignment with their Dharma, it makes many other problems sort themselves out. So Dharma is considered a very you might recall in that earlier screenshot of the Wikipedia description, Dharma is considered certainly to be preferred over Artha and Kama. In other words, there's a certain sort of noble quality to this particular triplicity. Now, if you think of it, the 1st house, right, it represents birth. The little baby is there, absolutely open and revealed and pure. There is no editing. Even the cry of the baby in the beginning of life is a very unfiltered, honest, pure expression of selfhood. And so basically the 1st house is, of course, very, very pivotal, and it's where our identity is manifested. And we're going to go into more detail regarding the special significance of the 1st house. Now, you know that the 5th house in both Western and Vedic astrology is associated with fun and play and recreation. And all of that is very true, and that there's that romantic streak to the 5th house. But really, the 5th house is where we dramatize ourselves in courtship. But, it comes essentially from a very pure and natural place. And so the 5th house is, apart from these things I've just mentioned, in Vedic astrology, the 5th house is also associated with intelligence. And we often speak of creative intelligence. And this is really that particular aspect of Dharma, or facet of Dharma, that the 5th house represents. It's also true that in Vedic astrology, the 5th house is associated with what they call Purva Punya, which means more or less past life credit. And so any planets in the 5th house tend to represent qualities or attributes or functions or faculties in our character that have been well developed in previous incarnations, and therefore we step into this life with those particular faculties and so on already very well developed, and so it's easy for us to utilize them. So, for example, a person with Mercury in the 5th house finds that mental exercises are very easy. They engage in complex intellectual exercises for fun, right? Whereas other people might find the very same things very laborious and very difficult. Somebody with Sun in the 5th house might come into this world with a very natural sense of authority and how to express that, and so on. Now, the 9th house in both Western and Vedic astrology is the house of religion, philosophy, and all of that sort of thing. And yes, the 9th house, you see, with all of these house triplicities, you find that there's also something like a progression that develops in the sequence. In other words, the expression of that particular aim of life is more basic and primitive in the earlier houses, and it becomes more refined, or it evolved and developed in the houses of a higher number, so to speak. So in other words, the ninth house is in a sense the fullest and ripest most complete expression of this principle of Dharma, and it manifests as our, so should we call it, spiritual realization, or our, on one level, literally our gurus and mentors. And of course, while gurus and mentors are important for all of us, they're particularly important in India. Now, another brief digression. The angular houses, the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th, or you might call them the cardinal houses. These are this house grouping is not one of the 4 M's of life, but there's a reason why I'm bringing this in here. Basically, we do understand that the angular houses, or they're known as kendras in Jotish, are places where the energies of planets are able to externalize themselves very fully and manifest most outwardly. Okay, so it's a very basic rule in Vedic astrology. Any planets that are in angular houses in the chart, in a sense, step into the foreground of the picture. And in fact, you can see here on the top left, in this North Indian chart style, the top middle diamond is the 1st house, on the left is the 4th, at the bottom is the 7th, on the right is the 10th. And you'll see that those houses are bigger than the others, and they form the sort of center of the chart. So, you know, that's one way in which that particular chart format seeks to emphasize the angular houses. And now the reason I brought in this little digression is because in Vedic astrology, a great deal of attention gets paid to various different ways in which the beneficial and fortunate and gracious qualities of the Dharma houses combine with the angular houses to produce what is often described as a Raja Yoga. Because the angular houses by themselves could be described as houses of karma or action. And when I use this word karma here, I'm using it in its, should we say, pure meaning as action, not as in karma, as in sort of, you know, debt that has been accrued or punishments that are going to be meted out. I'm talking about just the basic concept of action. So the angular houses represent karma or action, and action has consequences. The consequences may be good or bad. So, for example, a person with a very strong 10th house might come to succeed in the world, might even manage to dominate others and become very powerful. That may or may not be a good thing. When, however, the angular houses and this principle of action is combined with the integrity of the Dharma houses, that's when you get Raja Yoga. Raja means king, Yoga means combination. That's when you get action and the external manifestation of virtue, of righteousness. So, for example, you might have a person who has a very strong Dharma, but maybe not the ability to act in the world in a very powerful way. Of course, it's very good merely having that realization and that dharmic inspiration, but when that is aligned with action, many good things can happen. Now, a very key thing to take from all of this is that it could be said that the reason why the first house is really important in every chart is because it is the only house that is simultaneously an angular house and a Dharma house. And so the first house is where all of us find our Raja, our king power, you might say. This is also one reason why the first house or ascendant lord is always a benefic planet, or a planet that would not, under normal circumstances, cause us any harm. When it does, it is because of it is a result of that planet being under some sort of affliction by being in a very problematic house or receiving aspects from very difficult planets. Now, before moving on from this, I want to just give you a little example of some of the ways in which, on a practical level, this mixing of the Dharma and Karma houses occurs. If we took, for example, looking at this chart here, if we imagine for a moment that Aries was in the first house, it would mean that Cancer is in the fourth house and that Leo is in the fifth house. So the moon would be the lord of an angular house, and the sun would be the lord of a Dharma house. Now, if for this Aries ascendant, imaginary Aries ascendant chart, the sun and moon happened to be in a conjunction, and there was a merging of the lord of a Dharma house and the lord of a Karma house, that sun-moon conjunction wouldn't just be any sun-moon conjunction. It would have a special quality to it. It would be creating a Raja Yoga. Let's stick with this idea for a moment and imagine that we had an Aries ascendant here, and we had Sagittarius in the 9th house and Capricorn in the 10th. And so a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in such a chart would have a special quality that that same Jupiter-Saturn conjunction might not have for other ascendants. So whenever you have a conjunction of two planets where one is the lord of an angular house and one is the lord of a Dharma house, that creates a type of Raja Yoga. Now, when the lord of an angular house and the lord of a Dharma house are in opposite each other, it also does that to some extent. There's what we would call a mutual aspect there in Vedic astrology, and that would also qualify for the same sort of thing. So it's not only a conjunction. I'm using the most simple examples of of this. There's another particular concept known as the Raja Yoga Karaka. You note at the bottom here I said, hence the first house is always benefic and the type of Raja Yoga Karaka, because what happens is that for some ascendants, not all ascendants, but for some ascendants, a single planet creates a Raja Yoga because it is simultaneously lord of one angular house and one Dharma house. So, for example, imagine for a moment you had Taurus in the first house, right? That would mean that Capricorn would be in the 9th house and Aquarius would be in the 10th house. So Saturn then becomes lord of both the 9th and the 10th. In other words, Saturn becomes the lord of one Dharma house and one angular house. And so Saturn, despite being a natural malefic, becomes, in this context, what we would call a temporal benefic for the Taurus ascendant. And so this becomes very interesting and very subtle and very nuanced, because, it doesn't mean that Saturn only produces good times and fun and games for a Taurus ascendant. Saturn is nobody's mommy, so to speak. Saturn is nobody's buddy, and Saturn's never light and frivolous and playful. So Saturn can still cause some difficulties for a person with a Taurus ascendant in Vedic astrology terms, but there will also be certain benefits and beneficial attributes of Saturn and possibilities of Saturn that will be much more possible for that person to access than for people who don't have such a good relationship with Saturn. To give another example, imagine you had a Capricorn ascendant, right? So if you have a Capricorn ascendant, you have Taurus in the 5th house and Libra in the 10th house. So Venus becomes lord of the Dharma house, which is the 5th house, and an angular house, which is the 10th house. And so Venus becomes the Raja Yoga Karaka for the Capricorn ascendant. And so Venus, despite being a benefic in any chart and basically bringing very nice, sweet energies wherever it goes in any chart, more or less, for the Capricorn ascendant, and incidentally also for the Aquarius ascendant, it becomes the Raja Yoga Karaka and actually then becomes a doubly potent benefic. Wherever the Venus is placed for that particular ascendant then becomes greatly empowered. So although I might be laboring this point a bit, I'm hoping that I'm managing to illustrate for you one of the ways in which this, not only the Dharma houses and what they represent, gets applied in practice, but there's this very special situation with the Dharma houses and what happens when they combine with the angular houses. And this is a fascinating should I say a principle of Jotish that I think sort of gives a little bit of a glimpse of how nuanced things become. How planets have a basic quality as either being malefic or benefic, but then also sometimes there are certain special cases or circumstances under which a malefic planet like Saturn can be somewhat beneficial. There are also situations in which beneficial planets might not be that beneficial for particular ascendants. For example, for the Libra and the Capricorn ascendants, Jupiter isn't particularly beneficial. Now, Jupiter is beneficial, period, okay? But with a little bit of a tendency to also cause some little problems for those particular ascendants. So, this temporal status of planets never overrides the basic quality, but it adds a subtle further layer in terms of how the planet behaves. So let's look at an example here. Here's Martin Luther King. And just by the way, in all of these example charts that I'm using, I'm applying the sidereal zodiac, the Lahiri sidereal zodiac, and the whole sign houses. These are the basic default settings of Vedic astrology. But I'm putting it here in a Western wheel format to make it readable. It also reminds you that when you're looking at Vedic astrology charts in the usual diagrammatical format that they use in India, you can make it look like the systems are much more different than they are. But now, what we find is that the planet Jupiter, which is itself a planet of Dharma, Jupiter is the Bhava Karaka for the 5th and 9th houses, right? So this planet of Dharma, Jupiter, is in the 1st house. You can see here that Jupiter is somewhat above the ascending degree, excuse me, in a Placidus approach to houses, that Jupiter would be in the 12th house. When we use whole sign houses, I think in tropical or sidereal terms, that Jupiter ends up being in the 1st. So that's already one big thing. It tells us that this person is a person of righteousness, a person of Dharma. And it's interesting that Jupiter goes from being in tropical Taurus to sidereal Aries, and it's a fiery, brave, righteous person. Note also that Jupiter is Lord of the 9th house in the 1st house. And so, we can go into all kinds of other little bits and subtleties here. I want to just illustrate some very basic features of these charts this is when looking at a chart, even if we didn't know who this chart belonged to, that Jupiter in the 1st house should be one of the first things that stands out for us. Obviously, because any planet in the 1st house is going to be very important. But again, I want to emphasize it's not just the fact that Jupiter is a dharmic planet, but that the Lord of the 9th is in the 1st. And that in Vedic astrology is considered a very beneficial thing. In fact, it even creates a little Raja Yoga in itself. When the Lord of a Dharma house is in an angular house, even that creates a little bit of a Raja Yoga by itself. But now, before moving on from this, I want to just touch on Saturn being in the 9th house. You might be aware that Martin Luther King came from a family of preachers. I believe his father was also a preacher, and so there was an element of this sort of like sort of paternal religious heritage. And that Saturn is interestingly in Sagittarius, which itself tells us that the person might pursue a career in some way that relates to knowledge and higher learning and all this sort of thing. But you might recall that I was talking about the 5th house as the house of Purva Punya, and the fact that planets there are sort of like and very naturally expressed. In fact, planets in any Dharma house find that their natural attributes manage to be expressed very easily and very creatively, particularly their good qualities. So what's interesting here is that Saturn can have some dampening on the 9th house here, but the 9th house will have an elevating effect on Saturn. And so people with Saturn, like in the 5th or 9th houses, for example, are often very good with politics. They come into this world just understanding the way practical, real-world stuff works. And so this is one of the reasons why Martin Luther King was, he was a preacher and so on, but he was a person who also was had strong, let's we call it, political instincts, and the ability to work in and with and through the existing social institutions, albeit that he might have been trying to reform them and change them. He had, he was a person who, managed to rise in social stature. There's other reasons for that too, like Sun in the 10th. You might also note that Sun is Lord of the 5th in the 10th. Once again, you have this little subtle form of Raja Yoga, but I'll leave that there for now. Now, the Dalai Lama is an interesting example because, you see, once again, we have Saturn in the 9th house. And once again, we have a person who's both a religious figure, but also somebody who has needed to operate within the world of politics and all of that sort of thing. But there's another interesting thing to consider here. I believe that it is a rule in both Western and Vedic astrology that when the lord of a house is in its own house, and more often than not then in its own sign, that it means that the purpose of that house will be fulfilled. In Vedic astrology, certainly this is a very definite rule. In fact, in one Vedic astrology book, they say, even when the planet is a malefic, as we have it here with Saturn as Lord of the 9th in the 9th, it will still be good for that house, because they say that they in this book called Light on Life, excuse me, I believe they quote their guru as saying, even a brigand, even a bandit, you might say, will look after his own house. Okay. So here's a person who had these very old conservative teachers, and followed in a very sort of strict way a very specific spiritual path. Note that Mercury is also Lord of the 1st in the 1st. It's interesting that Mercury is literally called Buddha. That's the name for Mercury in Jyotish. And because the root of that word is really to know, indicates the idea of the knower. So having Lord of the 1st in the 1st is one of the things that also tends to mean that a person has a strong personality, a strong presence, a strong persona, can hold, kind of commands respect. A person with a very weak 1st house, for example, might find that they struggle to be acknowledged. They're overlooked. People don't find them to be substantial. So we've got a very strong 9th house, a very strong 1st house, And then we find Jupiter in the 5th house. Remember, Jupiter, remember the 5th house is the house of Purva Punya. So whatever is located in the 5th house indicates virtues or qualities that have been previously cultivated and that sort of just seem to manifest with amazing abundance and ease in this life. So Jupiter in the 5th house clearly points to the Dalai Lama having good karma in the realm of higher learning. Eva Peron, who became, who was declared, I believe in her lifetime, the spiritual leader of Argentina, and who, despite coming from a very humble background, which is shown with this Moon-Saturn conjunction, eventually became an inspiring figure who it could be argued even outshone her husband, who was the leader of Argentina. And what we find here is that Mars is Lord of the 1st house in the 1st house. The Sun is Lord of the 5th house, exalted in the 1st house. And it creates this powerful conjunction. Again, a Raja Yoga, the Lord of the 1st combining with the Lord of the 5th. And both of these planets are very high in dignity in their own sign or exaltation sign. And that's what it takes to make you come from a humble background and become a inspirational icon. And certainly we could describe her as an embodiment of, let's call it the warrior principle in its most elevated form. Now, what I simply wanted to show you here with Rudolf Steiner's chart is, excuse me, is really a good example of how the Bhavakarakas work. Remember that Jupiter is if there's a planet that represents Dharma, then it's Jupiter. And we can see that here Jupiter is exalted and in the 10th house. And so this great prominence that Jupiter gains and also the strength it gains by being exalted is one of the things that made Rudolf Steiner a very famous guru. Also having Sun, interestingly, in the very, should we say, humanitarian Aquarius, or the Aquarius is a sign associated with knowledge and science and all of this. It's interesting, the founder of the Anthroposophical Society has the Sun in Aquarius in the 5th house. So that itself, not only does the Sun as a luminary in the 5th house point to a person who will have a strong sense of their or a strong inclination to follow their calling in life and so on. It also indicates that there is this natural leadership. Now, the Artha houses, the 2nd, the 6th, and the 10th. The 2nd house in Vedic astrology is very much associated with food. Now, in Western astrology, the 2nd house is primarily about money. Some people speak of values for the 2nd house in Western astrology. I think it's often a very misleading term because it starts to connect the 2nd house to things that are really ultimately about more like the 9th house, like moral values. The 2nd house might show what you do value, but the 2nd house is essentially about things that are pretty concrete. I don't want to digress too much now, but in Vedic astrology, the 2nd house is associated with many things that Western astrology doesn't associate it with, including, for example, memory and erudition, knowledge and education, because the 2nd house is not only money and food, which is key in the context of Artha, but it represents, in particular, our capacity to learn through listening and to retain knowledge, and also how we speak. I mean, it's perhaps not missed for me to remind you that in the story of creation, the biblical story of creation, God said, "Let there be light," and it was so. There's something very powerful about speech. It's not just how we get heard, but there's also a certain creative potency in speech. I'm digressing a little, but it's not too far of a digression, because we also bring into being in our lives what we experience through our speech. But most fundamentally, in this context of Artha, I want to stress that food is money, basically. And that, yes, in Western astrology, they might associate the second house with food, because Taurus, the sign that corresponds to the second house, is famously a food-loving sign. And of course, because it's associated with the throat. In Vedic astrology, the second house is the face. The first house is the top of the head. The actual face, and in particular the mouth, is the second house. And it's when I say it is associated with speech, it will tell us about the tone and quality of the speech, whether or not the speech is pure and good and truthful, or not harmful and untruthful, for example. So the second house really represents the most basic level of material support. The support we get from our daily bread that keeps us alive. And another thing that the second house is associated with in Vedic astrology is the idea of family life. And when I say family life, I'm not talking about ancestry here. I'm not talking about blood relations here. I'm talking about the household, those people that you eat with, those people that you break bread with. Because, we are also protected and nourished and kept secure by that. So like a person who always eats alone is a far more vulnerable and poor person than a person who eats with others. And so there's, in the second house, beyond food and money, there's also a broader sense of it being associated with our capacity to manifest that support in our environment that manifests through a household that's nurturing. So, if the 12th house represents the enemy that is the secret enemy, as they put it, that is somebody close to you but undermining you. The second house is somebody close to you that supports you, Okay. Now, the sixth house represents, again, you have this progression here. The sixth house takes us beyond just this basic level of sustenance that we need on a day-to-day basis, and represents the skills that we develop and apply in life on a practical level that help us to stay materially secure. So a basic example of that is knowing how to grow food, how to harvest food, how to process food, how to take a log that is just, a tree that has just been chopped down, and process that into something, whether it's a tool or a sculpture or whatever it might be. But it's the capacity to transform substance skillfully in a way that enhances material security. So, of course, that can also be a job that we do, that we get paid for. It also has a certain bearing, of course, on medical sciences. Even that is based on understanding of how one can transform and manipulate through skillfulness the material world in order to enhance security. Okay. Now, the 10th house is the most developed of the Artha houses. And on the 10th house level, it could be said we go beyond these more basic ways of acquiring material security. The 10th house relates to where our stature, our status in society, enables us to, in a sense, sort of, I want to say, sort of command or demand the right to access certain resources. And actually beyond that, at the highest expression of the 10th house, we would be looking at, let's call it the archetypal politician or the mayor of the town, for example, where it not only is such a person generally well paid and highly regarded, but and because of that, for example, as the mayor, you would have a lot of credit automatically. You could just step into a restaurant and there would be no fuss about the bill. They'd be honored to have you there. But beyond that, at this highest archetypal level of Artha, a person is not just trying to manage their own material needs. They're making a contribution towards the larger social order in some way. For example, the mayor says we are going to expand the water piping to new households, and we're going to allocate new land for farming, etc. In other words, the material or Artha resources of the entire community come into play there. Now, note that Gandhi had Saturn in the second house. And, note that with the Libra ascendant, Saturn is Lord of the fourth house and the fifth house. So Saturn becomes the Raja Yoga Karaka for the Libra ascendant and the Taurus ascendant, incidentally. And so Saturn, while being a malefic in all cases, is somewhat benefic for the Libra ascendant. And Gandhi had Saturn in the second. So here's a person who, note that Moon is Lord of the 10th and the 10th, who despite having very high social status and being certainly able potentially to access almost limitless material resources, often chose to live very simply and in poverty. And he ate very simply. And in fact, he was so rigidly correct in his, and strict in his approach to money matters that many, some of his children, I believe, were quite resentful towards him because they felt that they were denied many opportunities that they really should have been entitled to as the children of somebody who was that important. But what I found very interesting about this Saturn in the second house as the Raja Yoga Karaka is the fact that towards the end of his life, I believe, he actually used fasting, in other words, deprivation of food. He actually used fasting as a means to force warring factions of Hindus and Muslims to make peace, because he was, despite being a Hindu, he was well loved amongst Muslim people because he refused to support any prejudice against them. And so he was a person who actually wielded political power literally through the second house. Very simple example here. We've got Jupiter as Lord of the first in the second. We've got an exalted Mars in the second, a very strong second house, and the Queen, no doubt, was very rich. It's a very simple example. But what we can also note here is that it creates a type of Raja Yoga, right? Because Mars is Lord of the fifth house, which is the Dharma house, and Jupiter is Lord of two angular houses, both the first and the fourth. Excuse me. So again, we have a Raja Yoga forming in the second house, and you get a person who is, by most people's standards, extraordinarily wealthy. Nikola Tesla was somebody who, I believe at some stage, I watched a documentary recently. I think at some stage he actually tore up some patent that he, or some contract relating to his patented work that could have made him countless millions, so that people would be able to benefit from some of his inventions without huge financial burdens. in other words, he wasn't somebody who was particularly interested in making a lot of money, but he managed to attract funding by very wealthy people for his projects because he was just that skillful. So we see here Mars is Lord of the first house in the sixth house, combining with Moon in the sixth house. And so we have here a person who really excelled in the realm of Artha, in quite specifically the sixth house context, a person who was really a master of how we can manipulate material substance with skillfulness in ways that can generate security and wealth. There are a lot of other things one could say about Nikola Tesla's chart, but that's for maybe perhaps another day. Now, this is one of the most interesting charts, or shall I say rather powerful charts that I've ever encountered. Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State under George W. Bush, and note that we have here a very strong concentration in the 10th house. Not only is there concentration of planets in the 10th house, Saturn, the Lord of the first house, is in the 10th house and exalted in the 10th house. Excuse me. And Venus, Lord of the 10th, is in the 10th. And Mercury, Lord of the 9th, is in the 10th. With the Lord of the 10th, and that creates a Raja Yoga there. And so there's, there's this sort of multiple ways in which that 10th house gains great prominence, and there's multiple ways in which this chart is just generally very powerful. We have an exalted Mars in the first house, an exalted Jupiter in the 7th house, an exalted Saturn in the 10th house, Venus in her own sign. Now, in Vedic astrology, when a planet is in its own or exaltation sign, while also being in an angular house, that creates something called a Mahapurusha Yoga. So she literally has 4 of these Mahapurusha Yogas, which is quite rare. And so here you would have a person who, again, is moving the chess pieces in society as a whole, rather than having to scrape together money for food. The Kama houses. All right, so as I said earlier, Kama means desire. And it is true that the air houses do have the social dimension to them. And as I said earlier, the 3rd house in both systems is neighborly interactions and so on. The 7th house is the spouse or mate, and the 11th house is friends and groups and all of this sort of thing. But the word kama, or desire, is interesting because it now gets us to look at these houses through a slightly different lens. You see, because the 3rd house is the desire that early bird has that catches the worm, so to speak. In other words, it's that get up and go energy. It's that immediate drive. The 3rd house is the arms. You use your arms to manipulate your immediate environment, to fulfill your immediate desires. See, so the 3rd house is the first most basic level of kama, and it represents the desires that are short-term and need to be instantaneously fulfilled. And there's where this Mars energy, as the karaka for the 3rd house, comes into it. Incidentally, the 3rd house is also associated with performing arts in Vedic astrology, because performing arts requires this high energy alertness and being completely present in the moment. Now, the 7th house represents the desire to mate, and the Kama Sutra is really a how to do it manual for 7th house Kama. Excuse me. And so, yes, the mating desire, we can actually see where this word desire can fit quite well with this house triplicity in the 7th house. But when we get to the 11th house, it's really interesting, because the 11th house in Vedic astrology would be called or described as our longer term life goals. This is where desires then have the longest and broadest range to them. And you might be aware that in Western astrology, they describe the 11th house as the house of hopes and wishes. Now, I believe that if you view that association or that phrase, hopes and wishes, from Western astrology, if you view that through the lens of the 11th house being a karma house, it suddenly starts to make sense of what is otherwise a rather strange and almost inexplicable association with the 11th house. So yes, the 11th house is friends. And by the way, the 11th house in Vedic astrology is also a very important house when it comes to income, at least as important as the 2nd house. But basically, planets that are in the 11th house in a Vedic chart will tend to tell us what that person hopes to achieve in their later life. And even if they're not fully conscious of it, when they arrive at around their 40s, late 40s, 50s, and so on, in the sort of riper stage of their life, the planets that are in the 11th house start to step forward, start to materialize more fully. So, for example, a person with Venus in the 11th house might find that their artistic interests and talents really start to blossom later in life. And or they may find that their interest in romance and their capacity to successfully materialize love in their life increases, and so on. Well, it's a fascinating thing to note. Now, Hitler had all his karma houses very strong. The 3rd house not only contains a luminary, the moon, and basically any house that contains a luminary is going to be highlighted because of that. So just having moon in the 3rd house is enough in any chart to make a person quite a lively person, quite an engaged person, quite a vocal person. But beyond that, Jupiter is Lord of the 3rd in the 3rd. So again, that's a basic rule, right? That the Lord of a house in a house always strengthens that house. And so from this, we don't only get all the things you'd normally associate with 3rd house in Western astrology. In other words, a person who maybe is very communicative or what have you. There's also this idea of a person who has a sort of a high energy level, high drive level. Now, the 7th house, note the 7th house Lord also is in the 7th. Mars is Lord of the 7th in the 7th, and the 7th contains quite a number of planets, and we also have an exalted sun in the 7th. Again, so we also have, both luminaries occupy karma houses, and now the 7th house, it does relate to the desire to mate. That's true, but there's also, I think, as you particularly in a Western astrology context, I suppose like a certain facet of that 7th house that is more confrontational. Note that the 11th house ruler, Sun, is exalted in an angular house. And so, in short, this really just illustrates that Hitler was a person with strong desires and had quite a strong ability to materialize or reach some of the goals that he had. And certainly his powerful communication skills is because of that very strong 3rd house, and which turned out to be quite instrumental to his success, but it was also helped, of course, by Mercury being quite closely opposite his ascendant. Bob Marley, Mars is Lord of the 1st in the 3rd, exalted in the 3rd, in fact, with the luminary. And remember, I was mentioning that the 3rd house is the house of performing arts. And even Hitler, for example, was a person who was very capable of performing. when he was jailed for a time for trying to overthrow the government, he made his trial a perfect platform to express his ideas with such fervor and passion that it actually made him very popular. So strong third house really gives a strong desire for expression. I mean, there's a lot of other things I could say about this chart, but I'm going to keep it centered on a few simple points. Now, Van Gogh is a very interesting case. He was born with a Venus-Mars conjunction, which almost invariably gives a person quite a strong charisma. Okay, I mean, Hitler also had that in his chart, and you find it in the charts of many people who have a charisma that others find attractive, and of course, it gives a certain creative vitality and all of that. That's all good and well. But when you convert Van Gogh's tropical chart to the sidereal picture, you start to see where some of this existential angst or some of the storminess in him comes from. You find that his moon, for example, goes from being in Sagittarius to Scorpio. You also find that Saturn goes from being in Taurus to Aries, where it's debilitated. And Saturn in Aries in Vedic astrology is something one finds with people who often have a strong desire to be a leader. They want to be in the forefront, but they're insecure about it. So they often will act like they're very humble for a while, but then they inevitably, sooner or later, become angry that they've been overlooked and so on. So there's a lot of this sort of pent-up anger and frustration that with Saturn in Aries that often leads to self-isolation. And I guess one of the points I'm wanting to get to here is that this debilitated Saturn in the 11th house might in fact be one of the reasons why Van Gogh really struggled, despite being a person of great creative energy and vitality, struggled to materialize some of his goals. He had some really grand and bold dreams and visions of artistic community and all of that sort of thing. But he tended to fall out with people, fall out with friends, and also that Saturn being debilitated in the 11th can point to poverty. I'll admit, from a Western perspective, some might say that that's Saturn in Taurus. Fair enough, I won't argue with that. But it debilitated Saturn in the 11th house, in as much as the 11th house also represents one's capacity to earn income, is interesting, in light of his lifelong poverty. Whereas the Sun, Lord of the third house, the house of more immediate desires, is strong. It's in the 10th house. And he was a person who had no problem waking up early in the morning and walking the long distance to catch, the ambience of the sunrise or what have you. He wasn't that he lacked the karma energy on its more basic levels, but his ultimate longer-term life goals were disappointed. Okay, so finally we get to the Moksha houses, and this is really interesting because, in both Western and Vedic astrology, I think there's broad agreement that the 6th house, 8th house, and 12th house are the difficult houses. And Vedic astrology further divides the houses into another grouping known as the Upachaya houses, which are the 3rd, the 6th, the 10th, and 11th. And the Upachaya houses are what they call improving houses or growing houses. So where I'm going with this is that although the 6th, 8th, and 12th are all somewhat difficult, because the 6th house also happens to be an Upachaya house, the 6th house offers more scope for the resolution of problems. Whereas the 8th and 12th houses, which make up 2/3 of the Moksha triangle, represent losses and setbacks that are far more permanent, far more irrevocable, far more completely final. It's a little like an organ that is amputated doesn't come back. You might wear some prosthesis perhaps or something, but it doesn't come back. It's not fixable in any substantial way. And now remember that the moksha houses are the houses that relate to, I want to call it, to spiritual life, and they often describe moksha as the houses of final spiritual liberation. And so the fact that 2/3 of the moksha houses are actually the most grievously difficult houses of the horoscope, in a sense, is reminding us of the fact that many things that we would consider disasters and misfortunes in this world are, in fact, perhaps from a spiritual perspective, actually very great blessings. It could be said that sometimes only when people lose many of the comforts of life that they've become attached to, do they really start to go within and really look at life in a more truly enlightened and conscious way, particularly recognizing that life is temporary and impermanent. Now, the 4th house is interesting because it's the only one of these houses that is relatively benign. And it is also, though, in its own way, of all the angular houses, the 4th house is the house that is most related to inner life. And the sun, for example, is in the 4th house at midnight. So it represents the idea of rest and peace. And also, in as much as the 4th house in Vedic astrology is associated with the mother, it is, in a sense, the gateway into incarnation, the bridge into this world, like through the womb of the mother, the bridge into this world from wherever souls come from. Whereas the 12th house, for example, in Vedic astrology represents the heavenly plane you go to after death. And it could also be said that the 12th house is really that cosmic soup in which everything has blended together and where there's no separateness. One Vedic astrologer named Robert Svoboda, who had quite a eccentric and radical guru, mentor in India, quotes his mentor as saying that moksha is the dissolution of your delusion. And this again is related to the ways in which particularly the 8th and the 12th houses remove many of the things in life that actually keep us deluded. In other words, many of the comforts that we enjoy, pleasant as they are, from a spiritual perspective, foster delusion. Many years ago at the Theosophical Society, there was a certain blind man from Kenya who presented a talk entitled The Ways to God. And the entire talk was really a description of various kinds of specific disasters and calamities that can occur in a person's life and how these lead a person to spirituality. So I don't want to overemphasize this idea that the moksha houses present all these things that are negative. They also represent ways in which we might explore spirituality in a constructive way. The 8th house would represent things like astrology, deep psychology, shamanism, things like this. The 12th house can represent meditation and sort of monastic inner work through solitude, etc. So there are ways in which people sometimes manage to embrace some of these austerities shall we say, or of the moksha houses, or like with eighth house, might even face some of the scary aspects of life, like what all the things that lurk beneath our conscious mind, for example, or the angels and demons shamans might engage with. There are the ways in which some people make that their business, and they can gain great satisfaction from it. But it always takes us away from what is in this world, really. So Paramahansa Yogananda is an interesting case. Well, on the one hand, he had moon quite close to the ascendant and in the first house of his Vedic chart, which is something that makes a person quite a popular and likable personality and makes you so much more likely to become famous. And I'm sure it contributed in a significant measure to him becoming famous. But that moon is also Lord of the 12th and the 1st, which is interesting, which also points to the fact that there's a certain sort of quality of renunciation that would come into the foreground of his life. But note that Jupiter is Lord of the 8th in the 8th, and this is a yogi. I don't know if, I'm sure some of you have read Autobiography of a Yogi, which is the book he's famous for. If you haven't read it, it's well worth it. You know, he describes several profound mystical experiences he had, which, whether you believe it or not, it's just interesting reading. And it is also said that for several weeks after his death, his body just failed to decompose, to an extent that was even noted by the people working at the mortuary as being quite rare, quite unique. So we certainly have here a case of a person who's got strong connections to this principle of moksha, but also Dharma, also in the sense that the moon is in the first house and the sun is in Sagittarius in the 5th house. You know, so this is also a person who, you know, he would certainly not have become famous, I think, if it wasn't for some of these you know, having an angular moon and having that sun in Sagittarius in the 5th house, which again means that you know, there's this idea of having past life credit as an authority in matters of religion and so on. Pope John Paul II, interestingly enough, had moon and sun in the 8th house. Now, I'm not sure I know exactly what that, how, you know, what that means. In fact, what I mean by that is it may have there may be things about him we don't know. You know, planets that are in the moksha houses, especially in the 8th and 12th, in a sense, they disappear from view. Just as the 8th and 12th houses relate to things that are not of this world, and connect us to things in the invisible world, planets that are in those houses also, in a sense, go into some sort of, like, disappear behind a veil, you might say. But the reason I wanted to share this chart was because it could be that it is one of the indications in his chart that he would have been a person who would have taken a sincere interest in deep questions like what happens to the soul after death, what is the nature of certain, you know, deep mystical questions about existence and all of that sort of thing. But as a little aside, it is interesting to see that he has this Jupiter close to the midheaven, which is exalted, and he was in fact elected Pope at the time of a Jupiter return on his midheaven, as a little aside. And like Rudolf Steiner, who also had an exalted Jupiter in the 10th house, you know, it's a good example of a manifestation of the principle of Dharma, you know, Jupiter as a planet of Dharma, having great dignity by sign and great prominence by house. Well, I'm going to leave it there. There are a few more case studies that I have, but I think that I'm pretty sure we've spent about as much time on this as is allowed and or allocated for this. And so I hope that some of you have found that there's been some food for thought for you here, and hopefully it might make you interested enough or curious enough to go and scratch around a little more with Jotish. Thank you very much.